Well, Jeff Duke and I have been working on looking at the causes and consequences of marital generosity and community generosity. And we began by sort of wondering if a lot of academic research on marriage could be impoverished in a way, in terms of thinking about marriage as primarily maybe a vehicle for the realization of self-interest, and as a place where equal exchanges in pursuit of these kind of self-interested interests are more likely to lead to intimacy and to happiness in relationships. You know, sort of the basic idea being that if people are able to maximize their interests and have fairly equal relationships, that's going to be the thing that's going to make them happy in their marriages, and that's going to be the thing that's going to lead to more marital stability. But of course, one limitation with this perspective could be that this kind of sort of self-interested orientation, this kind of deliberate on the part of spouses, might lead to conflict, unhappiness, and divorce. You know, insofar as a kind of self-oriented orientation, might be counterproductive in a fundamentally social relationship. And so the thinking here is that marriage, of course, is about many different things, but it's at least in part about solidarity, about establishing a pair bond with someone else, where you're attentive to that person and you're attentive to that relationship. And this, of course, is flowing from thinking articulated by people like Christian Smith and his work on sort of the notion we're social animals. And so if that's kind of the case, then high-quality, stable marriages may be more likely to be established, to be formed, to be maintained in a context where people are engaging in altruistic behavior, where they are attending to the welfare of their spouse and to the relationship more generally. And that one virtue, one behavior might be likely to foster kind of a solidaristic experience in marriage could be generosity. And then finally, kind of think about the sociological, particular institutional contexts, in particular values or norms or attitudes that are more likely to foster this solidaristic married life. So one institution could be religion, and different cultural contexts with different values, whether they be familism on the one hand or gender egalitarianism on the other hand, could be more likely to foster a solidaristic kind of marriage. So more specifically, our project is designed to see if generosity is a predictor of marital success, and whether it functions in a kind of a self-interested or more altruistic fashion, or maybe both manners. What are kind of the cultural and social sources of generosity in and outside of married life, both in the marriage and the broader community? And then on the sort of latter point, we're sort of following up nicely in Chris's comments just a second ago, is there kind of a zero-sum relationship between generosity in marriage and generosity outside of marriage, generosity in the broader community? So in terms of thinking about generosity in marriage, why might generosity be important for marriage? A couple of thoughts we have here. One is that it may be kind of a way of signaling. There's been more attention, psychology and economics and sort of recognition of signaling, that people who kind of regularly engage in generous behavior, that kind of putting these their spouse first in visible ways, maybe kind of signaling to that person that they have a priority in their life that's going to be valuable. Also could be signaling a sense of commitment, that they're in this for the long haul, they're willing to give away valuable resources now for this sense of a future together with someone else. They also can be valuable, or they can be valuable in repairing frayed ties. I mean, every marriage has its annoyances, disappointments, angry moments, angry periods, and so generosity can kind of maybe allow people to work through these difficulties and sort of repair frayed ties between spouses. Generosity too might be capable of introducing an element of novelty into a relationship, that people are doing things that are kind of surprising as part of their generous orientation to their marriage. That, from some psychological research, seems to be helpful too. And then too, also just building on the comments that Chris just made, it can be likely to sort of inaugurate a kind of virtuous cycle of giving, where one spouse gives something that's kind of, surprising or unique, and that in turn leads the other spouse to do the same in an important right way. We're also trying to think too about ways in which, generosity honestly can be viewed as a kind of a self-interested form of activity, or as a kind of other-centered activity. And it's just about kind of oiling a kind of a sort of self-interested, social exchange relationship where people are kind of doing it in a kind of contingent way, it could be the case that generosity is only likely to lead to good outcomes when both spouses clearly are engaged in sort of cycle of generosity. That might be more consistent with the kind of self-interested view of how it functions in the real world. But by contrast, if generosity is kind of meaningful for its own sake, and sort of it fundamentally functions, at least to some degree, as an other-centered behavior, it's probably linked to good outcomes for spouses, even when their spouse is not kind of reciprocating or reciprocating at the same levels. We can kind of look at that, periodically in our work. And then thinking about kind of the social and cultural sources of generosity, both in and outside of marriage, we're thinking about sort of generosity in the wake of kind of three important revolutions that have taken place in the last half a century. As many of you obviously are familiar with, there's kind of this notion, particularly by Robert Bella and his colleagues, that in the wake of the 70s, Americans have become more individualistic in orientation, more attentive to their own needs and desires, and in this case, less attentive to the needs of maybe family members, less attentive to family obligations, etc. And so that may be consequential for how generosity is practiced in marriage. Also seen a kind of secular evolution where religious behavior and authority is less salient in the lives of many Americans today. And that can be consequential too for the expression of generosity both in and outside of marriage. We've also seen a gender revolution where family life, where public life, work life, is in many important respects more egalitarian, both in terms of the actual behaviors, but also in terms of beliefs. And that can be consequential as well for the expression of generosity. So first, from the familism point, which we're looking at primarily in terms of pronatalism, kind of commitment to lifelong marriage, that may foster marital generosity by engendering a sense of trust and security, kind of long-term orientation towards your spouse, towards your family in ways that are linked to more generous set of behaviors, and also maybe investing in your family with more significance, which could also lead to more generous behaviors. But it's also possible to think about kind of the generosity outside of the family. That could lead to a kind of what Bainfield talked about, was a kind of amoral familism, as we're in Southern Italy, where people were kind of clearly generous towards their own family members, but they were not to members of the sort of broader civic or broader community within which they live. So there could be a kind of a negative relationship between familism on one hand and generosity outside the home on the other hand. In terms of religion, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, things to be picked up later by other scholars, but just we're assuming there's kind of a positive link between religiosity and generosity both in the marriage and outside the marriage. On the gender egalitarianism versus gender traditionalism fronts, we have put two different competing hypotheses. On the one hand, it could be that egalitarianism, drawn on work by Paul England and others here, insofar as it kind of fosters shared practices kind of in the home and in the workplace, where spouses are kind of enjoying a kind of similar life, both in and outside the home. That may be conducive to a kind of marital friendship, marital solidarity that then leads to more generosity. By contrast, if couples are organizing their lives along more traditional lines when it comes to gender, then that leads to more time for one another in the marriage. Particularly also time for women to do more volunteering outside their homes. We kind of test that idea too in our models. And it also could be the case that kind of interdependence established in a traditional model fosters a kind of gratitude between spouses that then leads to generosity. And then, once again, sort of drawing the Bainfield kind of idea, it could be, too, as we think about the link between marital generosity in the family, that that's maybe operating in tension with being more generous outside of the family, so support the possibility of kind of a zero-sum relationship. So with that as a way of introducing our project, I'm going to turn it over now to Jeff to talk about the data and the results.
So I teach statistics to graduate students in my day job. And so I recognize that glazed eye look. So I'm going to try and proceed pretty quickly so we don't get to that point. And if you have questions about more in-depth in the methods, we'll get there. But I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Basically, we drew data from Knowledge Networks, which is a survey research firm. They have a large national sample. We asked for their married couples. Between the ages of 18 and 45, we wanted childbearing age couples. We also, for the 3 studies that we ran, we had these inclusion criteria. We wanted both the respondent and the spouse in the data so we could look at both reports of generosity. They had to have post-ratification weights, and so we had a sample of, final sample of 1368 couples where we had both the data from the husband and from the wife. In terms of generosity, we had a scale of 4 items: how often they engage in small acts of kindness, such as making coffee for their spouse, or rubbing their feet at the end of a long day, how often they express affection, how often they express respect, and forgiveness, which can be an incredibly generous act, given the potential for our spouses to hurt us. The factor analysis evidence, high factor loading suggested that one factor was the best solution. I can give more evidence for that later if you're interested, but they did seem to hang together. Okay, there was other evidence that we had that suggested we're tapping one construct here. In terms of our other measures, I'm actually not going to go through them one by one. Just suffice it to say that most of them were multi-item scales. They all had Cronbach's alphas of 0.7, 0.8 or higher, and they were all, just established good measures to take a look at. In terms of our question about marital generosity and marital quality, we were wondering again, how is marital generosity associated with marital quality? So this is kind of a consequences of generosity question. We used marital satisfaction, marital conflict, and the perceived divorce proneness. Okay, how much the spouses perceived that they were going to divorce. How is that associated with generosity in the marriage? What we found was that, not surprisingly, husband's generosity was associated with higher levels of wives' marital quality report. So this was the advantage of having dyadic data, is we could say, the husbands reported how generous they were towards their wives, and the wives reported their own marital quality. We can associate that. We did find that. We also found, for the same, by the same token, that wives' generosity, her reports of generosity toward her husband was associated with husband's reports of higher marital quality. Then we looked at, okay, we've got spouses reporting their generosity towards their spouse, but then we also looked at their own generosity, and we found that net of spouses reported generosity, their own generosity was associated with their own marital quality. In other words, this idea that the giver was benefiting by generosity, even after we controlled for spouses reports. We did not find, with the exception of divorce proneness, we did not find that generosity had to be reciprocated. And in most conditions, the spouse's generosity, the own generosity was associated with own marital quality, regardless of the level of spouse's generosity. The exception was divorce proneness. Couples where both were generous, these were the least divorce prone, and there were some combinations, particularly when the husband was generous but the wife was not, that were particularly divorce prone. It was subjective. I saw a hand.
Yeah, just a clarification. So you're doing it all in one model, so you're controlling for what going in one model?
Right. We control for own generosity, spousal generosity, and then to check whether there needed to be reciprocation in interaction terms. So the bottom line was that giving and receiving marital generosity was associated with higher marital quality. The predictors of marital generosity project, again, we were trying to figure out what social cultural factors were predictive of generosity in the marriage. We had a lot of interesting predictors. We've kind of pulled these. First, the more closely husbands and wives reported sharing the housework or the child care in the marriage, the more generosity they reported. Okay, so certainly the idea of egalitarian behaviors, not attitudes, interesting, but behaviors were linked to higher reports of generosity. Marital commitment, right? I think we measured it in terms of Scott Stanley's ideas about personal dedication. Marital commitment was associated with generosity. We found that people, whether or not they had children in the marriage, people who thought that raising kids was a positive thing also reported more generosity. And then religiosity was also positively associated with husbands' generosity. It was also associated with wives' generosity until we added the commitment piece, and when you added the commitment piece, the religiosity went away for the wives. So what we see is that we get egalitarian gender roles, familistic attitudes, and religiosity being positively associated with marital generosity. And this is kind of interesting that we find, both religiosity and gender egalitarianism, although they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Oftentimes in the sociological literature, they are treated as such. And so we wonder if maybe there are kind of two models going on here. We may have highly egalitarian couples or highly religious couples, and both models are pushing toward more generosity, whereas couples who don't espouse either type of model are less generous. And we actually find some support for that in very, very preliminary analyses in our data. And finally, this question is, does marital generosity cut down the community involvement? And we measured community generosity as well, both volunteerism and financial giving in terms of percent of income. What we find is that in our initial analysis, marital generosity was positively associated with volunteering and giving in the community. It was not sort of this competition model where marital generosity would cut down on community generosity. But when we controlled for religiosity, that initial relationship went away. In other words, what we think is going on is a kind of a selection model where religious individuals are more likely to be generous in their marriage and in their community. So that's something's going on, we think. We also see gender egalitarianism actually has less community giving, which is kind of interesting. Egalitarian behaviors was associated with more marital generosity, but less community generosity, which is something we need to tease out. We also see that women's familistic attitudes were associated with more volunteering and giving. So the bottom line from this study is really we think it's not a competition model per se, but it's also not necessarily that generosity in the marriage is creating more generosity in the community. We think it's just a selection effect going on where religious people are doing more of both. I think that's...
So just to conclude, what we're suggesting here in this work is that in marriage, husbands and wives give the gift of themselves to one another, seem to be more likely to enjoy stable and strong marriages and be generous members of their communities. And in terms of the context that we've explored in this research, it looks like both inside and outside the home, familism and religion seem to foster generosity, and that inside the home, kind of domestic egalitarianism is also fostering marital generosity. But kind of stepping back from the kind of particulars of this particular research project, if generosity is any indicator, we think family scholarship should be more attentive to solidaristic behaviors and orientations as fundamental building blocks for the formation and maintenance of strong and happy families. Thank you.